Hello and welcome back to Dateline New Haven, our second segment of the day. This is Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Have the pleasure today of having a return visit from Marci Shore. She's a Yale professor of intellectual history. She's been in the news along with two other Yale professors who have decided they're going to leave Yale and move to the University of Toronto. Marci, thanks for coming on air today, and it's so nice to see you, even if it's remote.
It's nice to see you too, Paul. Actually, I can't see you.
You can't see my
moment,
face?
but I can hear you.
Okay. I see you're
I'm imagining you.
Where am I talking to you from?
I'm in Toronto right now.
And there aren't a lot of books on the shelves.
No, because it's a new office and I haven't actually moved books from New Haven to Toronto yet.
So those aren't Maiden Square books and behind you. Those are the last person's books?
No, those are my books. Those are the ones I had with me in my suitcase because I'm using them right now to finish the book I'm working on.
So you kind of had this bookcase. You're going across the border. You're fleeing these terrible things happening in America. You've written books about people doing that in other parts of history. Did you kind of feel like you were in some kind of old, grainy film with your suitcase leaving a country that's on the cusp of fascism, or am I exaggerating?
I think you're exaggerating a little. Not about our country being on the cusp of fascism, but about the drama of my life in particular. I fear my life is not nearly as dramatic or exciting as it somehow seems to be appearing in the press. The offers that we had from University of Toronto had been in the works for a couple years, and it was a very complex family decision. We might well have decided to come anyway, even if it hadn't been for the fascist takeover of America. So I'm a little bit mystified that, my and Tim's and Jason's leaving Yale for Toronto has become an international media story.
And just so we tell people what that story is. So you are married to another Yale professor, Timothy Snyder, who's also, like you, written about the disappearance of freedom in places like Russia and Germany and Ukraine, or attacks on Ukraine. Jason Stanley studies fascism. He's a Yale professor. And all three of you have accepted offers from University of Toronto at a time when people are like yourselves have been urged or even spoken about the need to consider leaving the country while you can. Is that over dramatizing?
No, not necessarily. I should first say that it's not something that happened very suddenly. I mean, I'm both, a neurotic Jew and a historian of totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to over-determine, my neurotic catastrophism. And, certainly the present moment could be subtitled Vindication of the Neurotic Catastrophist.
But also, a scholar of totalitarianism is equally a frame of mind that would have someone put the current events into context.
Yes. No, I very much have
you study this and now you see it happening.
But the truth was, my impulse was to leave the day after the election in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I was terrified already then. I mean, there had been up to that, there were three moments in my life when something happened on a world historical scale that was so unexpected and devastating that I could not shake myself out of it. The first was being in New York on September 11th. The second was Trump's victory in 2016. And the third was the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, that I was in this state of paralysis. I understood that something catastrophic had happened. And
now I get 2001, you were there.
Yes.
In 2016, you were living here. And because you study this, you realized what was getting started. But it's kind of interesting when one is a student and also or a scholar and passionately cares about an issue the way you do about Ukraine, that you felt personally affected by it that way. That would affect your sense of safety because you saw it part of a series of international events that would have larger repercussions beyond the border of Ukraine into all of Europe, into America.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's probably a bit overdetermined. It's hard for me to disentangle. To what extent did I understand that this was the end of the post-war order, that this was the beginning of the Third World War? To what extent was I terrified for my Ukrainian friends and colleagues and students who were in Ukraine? All of those things were mixed together. And it's not as if I hadn't been paying attention or had no idea this might be coming. I was paying intensely close attention. But even so, it was something that had happened on a scale of horror that I couldn't I couldn't shake myself. I couldn't shake myself out of it. I thought, this can't really be happening. This can't really be
And you had
happening.
written the book about Maiden Square and about the uprising 2014, the citizens uprising. They got rid of a repressive Ukrainian government, and it was all that hope with the Purple Revolution and all that. So Marci, so it's been how many years that you've been considering an offer from University of Toronto, and are they actively recruiting Yale professors? Are they focusing on people who study fascism?
Um, I hadn't thought of it that way, in particular, and I'm not privy to what the university is doing overall. I know in our case, it's the Monk School for Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And Monk is a quite specific and very special place. It's a school within a university, a kind of a research institute, and also runs MA programs as well as undergraduate programs. And it was founded by the extraordinary Janice Stein, who is just a powerhouse and deserves her own feminist feature, very much um, apart from us entirely. But it was founded as an interdisciplinary place that was specifically designed to cultivate academic scholarship that was simultaneously public facing and engaged with the real world. So it's a particularly attractive, and good fit with my own, and I think with Tim's and Jason's as well, intellectual inclinations.
So when did they start coming? So they came to you. They said, "Hey, you want to leave Yale and move to Toronto?"
Well, that's what happens when you're an academic. People make inquiries here and there at different universities over the years, and moving is a big decision. It's a family decision, and it involves all sorts of things that don't necessarily have to do with universities or don't necessarily have to do with one's appreciation and respect for one's colleague. It has to do with thoughts about where you are in your life and where you might want to live, and is it time for a change, and where would be the best places for your kids to go to school at a certain moment in their lives.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't reduce it to
But when
a
did the offer first
relationship
come?
between a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years
So
ago.
what did you think at first?
I found it very appealing at the time.
Because
But again, there were all sorts of reasons. I was very worried about gun violence, especially as my kids got older. New Haven, as all of your listeners know, is a 45-minute drive from Sandy Hook. I've been haunted by Sandy Hook all these years. A guy with a gun, and as you know, we're a country where anyone can pop into a Walmart and pick up some toothpaste, a Monopoly game, and a semi-automatic weapon, and goes into the school, kills 20 some people, including 20 first graders. One of my brilliant undergraduates at the time was working part-time as an EMT, and he was one of the first responders. And he got there, and there was nothing to be done. Everybody was dead.
mm,
And so these, the impulse to, oh, would it be, do I want to get my kids somewhere else for high school had been brewing a long time. Where violence in America was going, the toleration for violence in America. I could feel with the rise of Trumpism how a permissiveness for violence, not just on the streets or not just in terms of a refusal for the Republicans to put any kind of gun control legislation in place, but also the potential for real large-scale political violence. You can feel that.
so a year and a
under
half,
your
you get this
skin.
offer, and how old are your kids
They're 12 and 14.
now? So you get this a year and a half. You go say, that might be interesting. I kind of wouldn't mind them going to high school in a place where people aren't just crazy shooting everybody all the time. What else happened in that year and a half? When did you make the decision, and did you weigh it against the normal academic trajectory? If you go to Yale, which is kind of the pinnacle of academic work, and now you're going to University of Toronto and leaving the country where you've lived your whole life.
Well, I should first say one difference between like myself and Jason is that I'm an Easter pianist. So my intellectual work had always been focused on a place that was not the United States.
Mm.
Hence my extreme attachment to and involvement in Ukraine. I've spent my whole adult life focused on Eastern Europe. These are people I know. These are my friends and colleagues. My main role, in some sense, as a historian, has been that of cultural mediator, as translator. What writers do, what historians do, is we try to help our readers make an imaginative leap into a time and a place where they were not. So it was always the case that a big chunk of my life, and this is true for Tim as well, although I try never to speak for him, was not in the United States anyway. It was always centered in Eastern Europe.
You grew up
I
here.
was I grew up here. Yeah, I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. But it had never been that my whole life was absorbed in being in Connecticut, or for that matter, I did my PhD at Stanford. I did a postdoc at Columbia. That's why I was there September 11th. My first teaching job was Indiana University. But my focus in some ways, and my intellectual life in some ways was always centered in Eastern Europe. So leaving the States the prospect of leaving the States was perhaps not as dramatic for me as for somebody like Jason, who's really not, I mean, not only is he a brilliant philosopher of language, but he's an Americanist, not just an American, but someone
So
whose
that's why you
intellectual
don't
life
need
has
to
been
be here
focused on
professionally.
American.
But what about leaving Yale? What about going like that? And you see this in journalism. People sometimes leave the big elite papers to do what they consider more meaningful work or a new direction, someplace that isn't as prominent. Did you have any thoughts about I'm giving up a pretty prominent perch?
I had many thoughts in many different directions. I should say I'm extremely grateful to Yale. It has been a privilege to teach at Yale. I have loved teaching at Yale. I've had fabulous students. I've had
Yeah, our previous guest was Nilay Hazari from chemistry, who was excited to hear you were on. He was just in the studio here. So he's had nice
great.
experience interacting with you. Yeah.
No, it's been a fantastic experience to teach at Yale, and I would never in any way want to suggest that I was not very grateful for that. I had never assumed that I would spend my whole career at any single institution. I don't think I have a particular inclination to institutional mystique in that sense. I love teaching at Yale. It's incredibly privileged circumstances. I also love teaching at Indiana University, and I've loved teaching at CEU when I pop in to teach a guest seminar, and I've enjoyed teaching lots of places in lots of different contexts. And I did feel like, okay, I've spent a lot of time in this place. I've gotten to know this place.
How many
Maybe
years?
It's time to move on. Almost 20 years. I came to Yale.
So
in
how did the process
2006.
happen? Year and a half, you get the offer. At what point did you think, okay, now I'm definitely going to go?
Okay, so Tim and I took leave this year. I mean, we went back and forth and back and forth. I felt like it would be better to get the kids out of the States before they started high school. I felt quite strongly about that. But the kids are also, I mean, for me, New Haven is one of many places I've lived in my life. For our kids, it really is home, or at least it's their American home. It's their home when we're on this side of the Atlantic. So they didn't want to leave. Their sense is that this is our home. And so we were weighing that as well. We were weighing where they were going to go to school. And we were due to take sabbatical anyway. So we took leave from Yale this year. And we thought, well, we'll go to Toronto on a kind of provisional temporary basis. We're not teaching for anyone at the moment. I'm trying very hard to finish this book when I'm not giving interviews now that this story seems to have become crazy. And then we'll make a decision at some point in the year, looking at how the kids are doing and how
So you've been living
adjusting.
in Toronto since when?
We've been living in Toronto, and on leave, not teaching for anyone at the moment, and we didn't make a final decision until after the election.
And why did you make that decision?
I should say after the election, but before this latest attack on universities. So a lot of people are saying, are you staying in Toronto because Columbia capitulated? We made our decision, back in, say, January before Columbia capitulated.
And
so
what
I don't want to
was
blame Columbia?
What made the final decision? What caused you to make that final decision?
You can't do a control study on real life.
Yeah.
I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for Tim. I was so devastated after the election. In some ways, even much more so than 2016. I knew it was going to be worse. I could feel we were about to descend into a reign of terror. And on one hand, I felt like the courageous thing is to go back and fight. And on the other hand, I felt like I don't want to bring my kids back to that. That's not how I want them spending their teenage years. Their whole life has been inflected by these world historical catastrophes. There was the first Trump election, which they knew devastated. They were 4 and 6 at the time in November 2016. So they didn't understand exactly what had happened, But they knew that something had happened that had absolutely devastated all the adults around them. And that very much inflected their childhood. Then came the plague and the whole world shut down, the sense of terror, and then came the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've been to Ukraine. They know people there. They know our friends and students who have been in trenches. They know people who have been taken captive and tortured. I felt like, that we've put these kids kind of through a lot. And do I really want to take them back, as we watch America descend into fascism, even if the more noble thing to do is go back and fight?
We're talking to Marci Shore, who's an American professor of intellectual history at Yale, one of 3 Yale professors who have specialized in the loss of freedom in societies who are moving to the University of Toronto. I'm not sure I buy it, Marci. That's the noble thing for you to stay. I don't. Who do you owe it to? You don't write about America. Who do you owe it to be here rather than Canada?
Well, the first thing I should say is that I come from a Jewish family, and so for me, guilt is like Foucault.
Yeah, we'll be guilty about anything. Yeah.
Power. Yeah, I know. Guilt is radically dispersed, omnipresent, implicit in all relationships. Yeah. It's very hard for me to process.
And actually, you would be a bummer if you didn't feel guilty about this, because then what would you do? Right? You got to feel guilty about something. Yeah.
I also spend a lot of time thinking about the Russian opposition and my Russian friends who have fled Russia, and the reasons why the Ukrainians, including very close Ukrainian friends and colleagues, will not sit at the same table or appear in the same program with Russians, no matter how hard they have fought and how much they have protested, and how devoted to overthrowing Putin they have been. There is a sense of that whatever they did, it was not enough. And my friends in the Russian opposition feel that way too. I mean, there's a sense of, we have failed, that failure is irremediable and unforgivable, and I thought, I am no better than they are. I'm in no way morally superior. It's not that when the Trump administration was taking kids away, wrenching them away from their parents on the US-Mexican border, during the first Trump administration, and throwing them in cages. I grew up in a Jewish community with Holocaust survivors, with those stories of people fleeing violence.
Well, the one that got me was the picture of Kristen Noem, the head of Homeland Security, posing in front of the barracks. And then, online they did the comparison shots of the concentration camps and where these people are being warehoused, even, without having been on trial and even facing the accusations of breaking the law, and deported there and warehoused in these horrible conditions. That's the image that really got me as someone who grew up hearing about the Holocaust. My father had been a soldier, one of the first soldiers to go into the concentration camps after the war, and always was worried. I'm glad he didn't live to see Trump. He was worried when Nixon was there that it was a return to that. But that's the picture that got me, Marci. That was the picture.
That was a horrifying, repulsive.
A deliberate photo op of Nazi-like conditions.
Yes.
I had a rabbi send me that photo.
All of us.
Yeah, rabbi sent me that photo. So you asked me, why do I work on immigrant help work? It's because that photo says it all. Yeah.
And you can feel the violence. You can feel the violence.
State-sponsored violence. Yes. So, Canada, you go to a province where Douglas Ford is the premier, and even though he's been taking a stand against Trump to appeal to nationalist votes, he's kind of Trumpy, right? Ontario has a politics that isn't exactly social democratic Western European, right? What kind of culture is it there? Do you feel different there? Do you feel it could happen there too?
I mean, my general feeling about things like, the rise of tyranny from being a historian is that it can happen anywhere. I mean, this was my feeling about Americans the day after the 2016 election, because I felt like everyone I knew kind of split off into 2 camps, or I'm going to describe them as 2 camps. Not the Trump supporters and the non-Trump supporters, because I'm in such a bubble I didn't know any Trump supporters. But there were my, East Europeanist, Slavicist friends who felt like this was the end of the world. And then there was my, more American-focused friends and colleagues who were walking around saying, okay, this is bad. This is extremely bad, but we're going to get through it. We're the world's strongest liberal democracy. We have checks and balances. Okay, everyone inhale, checks and balances. Exhale, checks and balances. And I thought, my God, we're like the people on the Titanic saying, our ship can't sink. And I thought, what as a historian is that there is no such thing as a ship that can't sink. That's an illusion.
And Tim Snyder had written in 2016, everyone should have their passport ready. You feeling that now? Do you feel like you're fleeing for your safety? In addition to your kids and gun violence, do you feel like you, Marci, sure that you want to be in Canada and not the United States because of what's happening? You want to be at University of Toronto, not Yale, because of what's happening right now?
I would say yes, but not necessarily in the sense that I think I'm so important that
Not
that this
important,
regime
safety.
is coming after me. But I have thought a lot. I mean, I've thought a lot about my relationship to violence. For one thing, I was back at Yale. I've been back at Yale a few times. And recently I was back meeting with some of my advisees, who I will of course continue to advise. I would never dump my students for any reason. I didn't when I left Indiana either. And a lot of my students have always been foreigners, which is not unusual. I mean, a place like Yale has a high percentage of foreigners. And I'm thinking now, what would I do if I'm walking down the street with someone? I'm sitting in a dining hall, I'm walking past the library, I'm sitting in a coffee shop, and some guys in balaclavas start to grab this person away. Would I be brave? Would
Mm-hmm.
I pull them away? Would I try to pull the mask off? Would I try to take a video? Would I scream? Would I cry? Would I run away? I would like to think that I'd be brave, but I don't trust myself to be brave.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm physically very cowardly.
But what about, do you feel like, what do you think about what Yale's doing now? Do you think they and Columbia and Harvard are making the right decision in trying to placate the Trump administration? There are some people who say if you got $50 billion, $40 billion, you could have, that's money for this moment when you're being told not to be an institution of free thought and independent check on civic society and power, that you make the decision that you use that money, even if it means you're going to be smaller, to do your mission, because there's no way to placate the demands of a totalitarian government that's going after intellectual life and civic life. And that in the end, no matter how much you try to placate, you won't be what you have that money for in the first place. Is that a simplistic idea? Like, what do you?
That is my inclination. That's my impulse. But I have to say, I have never worked in university administration. I have never felt responsible for an institution. So it may be unfair for me to say, how could they capitulate? How could they be so conciliatory? I signed an open letter that was going around that Myra Levinson at Harvard sent to me, saying universities have to unite. They have to stand in solidarity with one another. It shouldn't be each administration for its own. Universities have to get together and say no. And I know that there is a split, between university administrations and people who feel responsible on institutional level and faculty members.
What about you
And
reading a history? People who took that other position in Ukraine, in Russia, in Nazi Germany, were they right? Did history prove them right, that they should have capitulated so that to try to protect people?
Well, this is always the moral dilemma. Masha Gessen wrote an excellent column about this a few weeks ago in the New York Times, saying, in these situations, every person acting individually has a rational reason to make a compromise, to go along, not even necessarily out of selfish motives, but you think I'm responsible not just for me, I'm responsible for students, for children, for elderly parents, for this institution, for that program. And Masha, they said, well, what is rational at an individual level collectively is what makes tyranny possible.
Mm.
But it's the combination of all those compromises that make tyranny possible. And we know that. We know that historically speaking, and we know that as a sociological fact, which doesn't necessarily make the moral dilemma on an individual level any easier. There's a great podcast that Arkady Ostrowski did after the full-scale invasion called Next Year in Moscow. In the fourth episode, he interviews Chulpan Khakmatova, who is a famous Russian Crimean actress, and who has now fled Russia. But she was someone who took on this project under Putin of caring for child cancer patients, and building hospitals, and caring for the orphans and getting them the medical attention that they needed, and she threw herself into this. And she went to Putin at a certain point and he agreed to, I don't remember the details, to give her the building or to give her the money or to give her the structure that would allow her to create the space to take care of these children with cancer. And then came Bolotnaya, in 2011, 2012, and her friends were on the streets protesting, and Putin said, okay, I did this for you. Now you're going to get on television and you're going to express your support for me, or those kids are going to be out on the street.
Wow. Okay. First, we're running out of time, but I would like to hear more. What's your new book on that you're working on?
My new book is a very a very dense and character-driven history of the search for truth in East Central Europe from the late 19th century through the 21st century and post-truth.
I'm looking forward to reading that, whether you're writing it in Toronto or New Haven. Are you Canadian now? Are you going to be a Canadian citizen?
I am not Canadian now. I think I will probably remain American.
So you're not going to get Canadian citizenship?
Not tomorrow. I have no idea what will come in the future. But I have to say, I'm still very much and will remain kind of emotionally and professionally and intellectually engaged.
Are you selling your house?
Wherever I am.
Are you selling the house in New Haven?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, Marci, thank you so much, Marci, for joining us, and the best of luck in Toronto. Keep up all the great work you do, and the best for your family. And thanks to Doreen Chernecki working the controls. Harry Dross is on vacation. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.